All right. Howdy, Adam. K. Adam White. Welcome, my friend.
How's it going, Zach?
I am super excited to be chatting with you about your talk for the JavaScript for WordPress conference. So, first of all, thank you for taking the time. I know you are a busy person, as all of us are these days. So, we're going to make this a short conversation, although this is a little bit different because most of the planning sessions I've had with folks were like, okay, here's the topic we're going to do. Let's talk out the specifics. But if anybody who hasn't talked to Cadam before, it's kind of like talking to the vastness of the universe, you know?
I'm
So
not
we
sure I
have
put it
so
quite
many
that way.
things that we could go down a path with that I think what we had talked about is picking a few different ones and then seeing what we feel might be a good direction to go. That
Yeah,
sound good?
sounds good. I know that you were kind of curious about a couple of different angles, so I'm looking forward to hoping to find something that'll resonate with the people that are going to be attending the conference.
Cool. Well, let's do some flashbacks to this last year. I've had a chance to see you talk at WordCamp. It was US, I believe, that you did a Webpack and kind of having WordPress update at the same time as yours and not using some of the just off-the-shelf tools for performance reasons. And it all was amazing and cool. And I'd have to go back and rewatch it a few times to try it and make it work. But there's definitely that. And I've seen you give some Webpack workshops that have definitely helped me understand the better mechanics and all that. So where are you at these days with build tools in your own life and work and how you see it in the ecosystem?
I think it's an incredibly important part of the ecosystem. I'm extremely excited about the release of Webpack 4 this past week, actually. There was a really great presentation about that at JS Iceland, where Sean Larkin was talking through all of the new things that they've done to improve that tool. And I'm friends with Zac Gordon, who's another contributor to the project, who's been working a lot on performance and rebuild time with Webpack. So Webpack is continuing to get smarter and more powerful and more both more configurable and more easily configurable out of the box. They're trying to
Nice.
make it so that we can get as close to a zero configuration starting point as possible, so that if you have Babel installed, it'll detect it and try to do the right thing. And that adds magic, which I'm usually a little skeptical of. Sorry if there's any rumbling in the background. That's construction outside. But at the same time, it is really powerful. And so I'm very bullish on Webpack specifically. I think for me, it has done a better job of proving its worth than a lot of the other build tools that we've had, just because it combines with so many different projects and so many different types of application in a very, very efficient way. It's not necessary for everything, but if you're building a browser-targeted application, it feels like it's an obvious choice. And so I'm definitely still interested in that. Like you said, at WordCamp US, I presented about React WP scripts, a project that Ryan McHugh and some other folks at HumanMade and I put together to bridge Webpack with WordPress so that it's easier to dynamically detect things like I'm running a Webpack dev server, tell WordPress, here's where to load my assets, don't worry about them being part of the theme directory, for example. And on the one hand, that's still very interesting to me. That's still a project we're working on. I was actually just using it earlier today. But
Nice.
on the other hand, I've given that talk, so I leave it to you whether you want to retread ground or try to go off in some new direction.
Okay, so it sounds like one, there's Webpack continues to get better, more powerful, less configurable, and we've definitely seen some, close to zero config block building tools that, so there's definitely a need for that there. There's also the super deep level of what you're doing behind the scenes. But again, that's trying to present it and create something that's more usable for the average person. So there's so many ways we could go with that. Maybe the one question I have is, how do you see this in the day-to-day WordPress developers world in a way that we can, this is not meant to be kind of an intro talk, and if you've already kind of given something, I'd rather reference that, although I understand it's more work for you to prepare something new, but kind of reference that and build off of it, go to where we're going next or something like that. But in the average WordPress devs, and I don't know if your average day is a reflection of the average WordPress developers, but on a practical level, are there new things that are coming or deeper things that they can know that would help them in a practical way with what they're doing, plugins, themes, that sort of thing?
Practically speaking, Webpack is the sort of tool that you should be able to set up and largely not have to think about again. I think a lot of the work that the team has been doing has been moving the project in that direction, where it can be as minimal configuration and fire and forget as possible, and it just does what you need it to do and gets out of your way, because build tools are never why we are here. We only work on build tools because they are a means to the ends for building value for things that actually, building valuable things that actually help people. And so, you know, build tools help developers, but developers aren't helping developers for developers' sake. So it's tough. I think that there's a lot that we could do around Webpack, but a lot of it ends up, the practical stuff ends up being predominantly around initial configuration, figuring out how to get your plugins and loaders optimized. And I feel like that's fairly well treaded ground. Even with Webpack 4, by the time we get to this event in June, there's going to be, all the resources will be updated. I don't think that it's going to be a difficult path for anyone in the JavaScript community to get up and running with it, especially with the tools that are coming out of agency work that are designed to try to help bridge it in various ways to serve as sort of faster starting points.
Well, who would have thought we'd be saying, well, actually, Webpack is pretty straightforward, so I don't know what we really have to say about it, but I kind of agree. So allow me to, we can circle back to this, as I'm sure it might come up in other areas, but let's talk about data visualization, my friend, because for those who haven't seen your other talks, really good ones, I've watched them several times, and in them you do give a combination of higher level and practical stuff and even some code examples, but I'd love, and I think that there's a huge welcomeness to seeing some in-depth, codey, very technical talk on data analysis, kind of use cases when you're maybe using a framework versus needing to customize that, even getting into, especially in the WordPress context, it's not so JavaScripty, but how do we feed data into that, right? What's the most efficient way to do that? I don't know, are you doing much data analysis? I know you've worked with it and know some of the major tools out there.
Yeah, in my prior life doing data visualization at Boku, I certainly was involved with a lot of data dashboard, data exploration type projects. I'd say that at Human Made, we're definitely still doing a lot of things that require a lot of information processing. And at some level, I think that the point that I tried to make in my talk at WordCamp last year that you were referencing, so much has happened since then, that feels like a deep cut, but I guess it was less than a year ago. I think that in a lot of ways, we forget that just putting written words on the screen is also a kind of data retrieval and processing and display mechanism. And so I've been trying to use that same mentality, regardless of how technical the project that we're working on appears to have. Definitely, there's some interesting work that we've done around data pipelining in WordPress for visualization cases, but a lot of that same processing is just what we have to do if we are building out API endpoints or building out any sort of data pipelining or rendering within WordPress traditionally. So I don't think it's as disconnected as people probably think.
Ooh, I really like this. Like, I got that good belly feeling when you start talking about this, because it's something that is like kind of a buzzwordy still thing. People want to understand, definitely in the JavaScript world, it's a skill set that you probably want to pick up at some point, but also getting into, like you said, the pipelining of it, making that practical, kind of tying it to maybe WordPress a little bit, but also expanding it into how you think about pretty much everything that you're doing. Almost like everything is data visualization in a way, and data analysis as you're setting it up and configuring it. Interesting.
In terms of what we might be able to do around that, there's a lot of technical specifics of various libraries like D3. There's a lot of more specific charting libraries that are not as flexible as D3, but give you easy constructs for basic types of graphs. I usually end up just rendering out SVG from React or Vue. D3's something I'm very experienced with, and it's probably a better solution if you need to do really complex animation. But from a tooling standpoint, most of the time, if you're trying to build a graphic that is static or has some very basic movement to it, it's easier to render SVG using something that has a declarative rendering style like Vue or React, rather than doing the chaining and element creation, a much more sort of old school jQuery way of thinking about elements that D3 encourages. So it's a kind of broad field from a tooling standpoint. Also, there's visualization, which is near and dear to my heart because I like things that are interactive and interesting and visually engaging. But there's also just pipelining and analysis, and that doesn't even have to be JavaScript. When I built a data dashboard for health clinic efficiency metric tracking, we actually replicated the same data pipelining process in PHP and on JS, so that whether we were hitting it on the initial page load or rendering after a front-end transition, we were able to get access to the same information. So there's nothing really JavaScript specific about analysis. A lot of the new buzzwords, actually, data visualization is still quite cool, obviously, but a lot of the data analysis work, I think everyone's looking towards more machine learning oriented heuristic measures rather than trying to have quite the same sense of handcrafted artisanal data analysis that we maybe were into a couple years ago.
Well, now we've cracked another interesting window in the conversation, because I think that you're right in where that might be leading and kind of the evolution of things are going. One small little practical thing that you did mention, which I think is nice, which is the SVG rendering with React and kind of building things your own rather than needing to use a D3, especially in terms of what probably maybe even 80% of a normal WordPress dev's kind of visualization needs to look like, can handle well. And that's something that's not so beginner, but it's also kind of expands your way of thinking about components outside of just, rendering a text UI or, whatever that way layout. So that's interesting. You did mention the kind of machine learning or deeper system or neural network kind of thing. I don't know do we want to begin pioneering a field down that approach?
I'm going to say maybe that's out of scope.
2019. Okay, we'll see.
No, there's a lot of stuff you can do with it. Honestly, my use of machine learning has so far been limited mostly to art. Taking all of these incredibly powerful tools and using them to generate random text or images or style transfer rather than actually using them for data analysis. But if people are interested, I would suggest the Cadenza course on TensorFlow. There's a lot of good resources, but it's a deep topic. I don't think that it's probably the best use of our time for this particular endeavor.
Cool. Okay, let me throw out one other thing that we did kind of mention beforehand that we could chat about, and it might not necessarily be a topic in itself, or it might tie back to some of these other things, but performance has come up, and we have some great talks, but there aren't too many specifically that would deal with that. So on its own, what are your thoughts on this? In relation to maybe some of the other conversations, obviously it ties back to Webpack, right? It ties into the data visualization, the pipelining, all of that.
Yeah, it's a good point. Performance comes up in Webpack in terms of trying to optimize the code you're shipping to users as much as possible. I think that the latest word from Google is that they really want to see, 150 kilobytes gzipped of JavaScript is what they consider to be a reasonable maximum for shipping to a person using a lower powered mobile device, just in terms of that then incurs maybe 5 seconds of delay before the page is interactive on certain low-powered devices, and that's a huge make or break for people. So there's a constant push from browser vendors and search providers around being more efficient in terms of what you ship down the wire. Conversely, there's a lot of interesting work out there that is framework specific around how you can build something in React or D3 or Vue in such a way that it's going to be really efficient and performant and responsive, not in the sense of squishy windows, but in the sense of, if I click on this, does it do what I expect it to do in a reasonable amount of time? Kind of like more interface-oriented responsivity rather than this sense of how much do we ship over the wire, what's our time to first byte. So those are completely different topics. I think there's, even within the sense of optimization on the front end, you can be looking at things like how do you make it so that you do number crunching in JavaScript on the browser without locking up the user's UI thread? How do you make sure that if you're loading data, you give the impression of perceived performance, even if you're doing more work in the background. I'm blanking on her name. There's a really great talk from WP Conf about the benefits of smoothing over data fetches with interesting animation. So that's...
I love it.
Yeah, it's useful. It improves people's experiences of a site, and that improves how engaged people are, and that can make or break your business. So I think performance is important, but I think it's probably something to touch on in the context of a specific goal that we're trying to achieve.
So let me bring it back to the context it came up in, was in a context of design and UI experience, so that when you're designing an experience, it could be as pleasurable as possible, and there's stuff developers can do to make that better, and then there's stuff the UI or design team or UX can work with there too. So that might be a nice bridge, because what I'd love to do ideally is have some of these talks, web and weave into each other in nice ways.
Yeah, I know we actually talked about this, but how long are the sessions, and
Yes.
What are the other confirmed topics? That might help narrow things in a little.
Okay, so we have 50-minute sessions with 10 minutes of Q&A, and topics are going to range from actually, I think one person had actually asked if they could speak about build tools. There are things that are Gutenberg specific, things dealing with data. Like I said, some stuff dealing with design, some React specific stuff, the data redux. I think for a moment, some of them are more like architectural, like thinking more programmatically and like a programmer, some stuff on how to best learn and keep yourself adaptable. And then some REST API, GraphQL. Yeah, we need to cover the mobile, but those are kind of the range and feel of it. Oh, and some stuff on like history of core and other WordPress things besides just Gutenberg that are JavaScript related.
Okay. It's a nice diverse set of topics. I think there's a couple different ways that everything that we've been talking about might be able to slot in to fill bridge connections in that space. One of them might be just 50 minutes is a long time. That actually gives us enough time to, for example, just build a practical example of a application with a little bit of REST API data modeling, and then a UI front ends to browse that data in a way maybe a little bit different from what WordPress normally affords. So something like a recipe browser, or what's another kind of basic kind of data, something that people can relate to that might be useful just to be able to see overviews of the information.
Podcast shows.
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
So that's one idea.
I like that. That does pull together a few different things. What would we and of course, I think you'd probably be able to even mention a number of the different things we've talked about with that. What do we call something like that?
That's a good question. That I'm not sure about.
Okay. Does that?
I made a library for the WordPress REST API. I called it WordPress REST API NPM package. I'm not good at naming things.
Okay. So what about what's the topic then? Because the first thing I want to do with the schedule is just get a list of speakers and their general topics, and then we can come back to a title specific. Are you feeling that something has come into focus for you based on all this? I
definitely am sort of puzzling out how this might play out, and it's definitely interesting. Is there, before we go down this road and commit, is there anything else that we've touched on that you feel wouldn't be served by a practical example of putting together a small, let's say, mobile-oriented application for entering and browsing some type of data records?
I think that all the stuff that we're doing is ultimately so visual, or at least in terms of performance or other things, you want examples of kind of before or after of or why this approach matters, and seeing it. That I think that is something that if you were okay putting the time into building that, because I know that does take more work to do something like that, I think that could be a really helpful tool for people being able to internalize this. And also because I would hope that someone could take enough out of this to go do something with, right? So the more resources that there are around that, then the just easier it is for the average dev who we're hopefully targeting here could work with that, right? Then I think
something around practical data modeling and display is probably a good idea.
Ooh, practical data modeling with JavaScript and WordPress, baby. Now we're on to something.
I don't know. I don't know if we're onto something right there. I think that might need some grooming too. That sounds like the sort of title of a book that I pass over in the store.
That is fair. I mean, we do want to make it kind of pop and relevant.
But maybe we can use something like that as a placeholder for now.
I think that in terms of a topic or something along those lines, that could give us what we need. And then just from here, so we're a little bit out. I just have some final touch points to ask you about. We're a little bit out in terms of timing, but we'll circle back in another month or so just so this could percolate, and then maybe we'll try to come up with a title and some
Yeah. Well, let's coordinate over the course of March, and I think if probably by that point we'll have something firmed up better and can start moving towards having the material ready.
I love it. And then in terms of time zones, you're a EST.
Yeah, I'm in New York, so okay. I'm going to be in New York until April, and I'll be out of pocket for the majority of April.
Okay, nice. And then is there the day of, within that kind of 9 to 5 Eastern Standard Time, a time that is better? Would it work for you if I were
Depends on the day. I got colleagues all over the world at any given time. Who knows? But it's
the Friday, the June 29th is going to be the day of it. So I'll just try to stay in touch with you and get you as soon as possible, though.
Yeah, and I'll try to block that day off because I'd certainly like to participate in the rest of the festivities as well.
Would love that, my friend. Hey, well, Kadam White, thank you again for your time. Really appreciate it. Excited to see where this goes.
Absolutely.
Ciao, man.
See you soon.